Welcome. Hi, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming. This is a great crowd. I'm Luis Jaramillo, the interim director of the School of Writing at the New School. Here at the New School, we constantly ask ourselves what it means to be a writer in the world. We ask ourselves what responsibilities we have as creative people, and we puzzle over how best to fulfill those responsibilities. We are so honored to have here tonight Arundhati Roy, a writer whose fiction and nonfiction asks these questions with urgency and grace. Arundhati Roy will read from her new book, Capitalism, A Ghost Story, and will join in conversation with Siddhartha Deb, a beloved member of the New School writing faculty. I am now pleased to introduce our co-sponsor for tonight's event, Anthony Arnoff, an editor at Haymarket Books, the publisher of Arundhati Roy's newest book, as well as her earlier book, Field Notes on Democracy. Please join me in welcoming Anthony.
Thank you, Luis, and thanks to everyone for coming out tonight. Just want to make a few quick housekeeping announcements. As Luis mentioned, I'm Anthony Arnoff from Haymarket Books. There's a few people we want to thank and just a few things we want to share with the people who are not only in the audience tonight, and it's great to see all of you, but also the many people who are watching this on a live stream and who are in overflow rooms. The first bit of advice is if everyone could turn off their National Security Agency tracking devices, we would greatly appreciate that. We also want to let people know that Arundhati will be signing books after this event. I'll come up at the end and explain exactly how we're going to run that. But basically, if you want to get a book signed, just stick around in your chair, and we'll make an announcement and then bring people up for a signing after the program. And you can get books in the lobby from Haymarket Books. And if you're in an overflow room, come back over, and we'll have plenty of room to accommodate everyone afterwards. Livestream.com is live streaming if you want to let anyone know who can't be here tonight. They can join in there. We want to thank Luis, as well as Lori Lynn Turner, the Associate Director of the School of Writing, Pamela Tillis, who's the Director of Public Programs, who made this remarkable space available to us tonight and did a fantastic job organizing it, getting out the word, Sam Biederman, Director of Communications, Mark Fitzpatrick, Director of Media Services. Also, Jason Farbman of Haymarket Books really pulled this together in many remarkable ways. And also, we want to thank all of our many volunteers and the staff of the New School. It took a number of people to make this possible. Book TV and Democracy Now! And Free Speech TV are all here in the house tonight, and we want to thank them and let you know that you can catch this and tell other friends to watch those programs in the coming days and weeks. You'll be able to see tonight's program there. I have the great privilege of introducing briefly and quickly Arundhati Roy and Siddhartha Deb for tonight's program. Siddhartha Deb, who grew up in Shillong, India, is the author of two novels, The Point of Return, which was a 2003 New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and An Outline of the Republic. His reviews in journalism have appeared in The Guardian, The Nation, Caravan, New Statesman, N+1, Times Literary Supplement, and The New York Times. His most recent book, The Beautiful and the Damned, A Portrait of the New India, had its first chapter removed from the Indian edition through a court order, was a finalist for the Orwell Prize in Britain, and is the winner of the PEN Open Award in the United States. He teaches creative writing here at the New School. Arundhati Roy was born in 1959 in Shillong, India. She studied architecture in New Delhi, which is where she now lives. She is the author of the novel, The God of Small Things, for which she received the 1997 Booker Prize. She's written a number of nonfiction books, which are available here tonight in the lobby, including, among them, The Cost of Living, Field Notes on Democracy, An Ordinary Person's Guide to Empire, and Walking with the Comrades. Her newest book is Capitalism, A Ghost Story, published, I'm very proud to say, by Haymarket Books. And hope you will join me in welcoming her to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay. What I'm going to do is to talk a little and read a little, but to try and follow my natural instincts as a storyteller, even though a lot of what I write is about politics. So Capitalism, A Ghost Story is about the ways in which capitalism works in the modern day, which isn't always what we think. You know, it's not just about corporations and privatization and how does it colonize our imagination? How does it tame us? How does it make us into people we don't even know that we are? So I'll just start at the beginning of this book, and I just sort of read bits and talk a bit, and then if I'm being totally incoherent, you can ask me questions afterwards about it. Is it a house or a home? A temple to the new India or a warehouse for its ghosts? Ever since Antilla arrived on Altamount Road in Mumbai, exuding mystery and quiet menace, things have not been the same. Here we are, the friend who took me there said, pay your respects to our new ruler. Antilla belongs to India's richest man, Mukesh Ambani. I'd read about this most expensive dwelling ever built, the 27 floors, 3 helipads, 9 lifts, hanging gardens, ballrooms, weather rooms, gymnasiums, 6 floors of parking, and 600 servants. But nothing had prepared me for the vertical lawn, a soaring 27-story high wall of grass attached to a vast metal grid. The grass was dry in patches, and bits had fallen off in neat rectangles. Clearly, trickle down hadn't worked. But gush up certainly has. That's why, in a nation of 1.2 billion, India's 100 richest people own assets equivalent to 1/4 of the GDP. The word on the street and in the New York Times is, or at least was, that after all that effort and gardening, the Ambanis don't live in Antilla. No one knows for sure. People still whisper about ghosts and bad luck, Vastu and Feng Shui. But maybe it's all Karl Marx's fault, all that cussing. Capitalism, he said, has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange that it's like the sorcerer who's no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. In India, the 300 million of us who belong to the new post-International Monetary Fund reforms middle class, the market, live side by side with the spirits of the netherworld, the poltergeists of dead rivers, dry wells, bald mountains, and denuded forests, the ghosts of 250,000 debt-ridden farmers who've killed themselves, and of the 800 million who've been impoverished and dispossessed to make way for us, and who survive on less than half $1 a day. But Mukesh Ambani is personally worth $20 billion. He holds a majority controlling share in the Reliance Industries Limited, RIL, a company with a market capitalization of $47 billion and global business interests that include petrochemicals, oil, natural gas, polyester fiber, special economic zones, fresh food retail, high schools, life science research, and stem cell storage services. RIL recently bought 95% shares in Infotel, a TV consortium that controls 27 TV news and entertainment channels in almost every regional language. Infotel owns the only nationwide license for 4G broadband, a high-speed information pipeline, which, if the technology works, could be the future of information exchange. And Mr. Ambani also owns a cricket team. So you have these huge industrialists who have this cross-ownership of businesses. And then you have huge media houses, like, for example, a newspaper called the Dainik Bhaskar, which has a readership of 17.5 million readers in 4 languages. And they own 69 companies, which are mining companies, power generation companies, real estate companies, textile companies. So you have this kind of way of controlling information, imagination, and business, and land, and agriculture. RIL is one of a handful of corporations that run India. Some of the others are the Tatas, Jindals, Vedanta, Mittals, Infosys, SR, and the other Reliance Anil Dhirubhai Ambani Group, owned by Mukesh's brother, Anil. Their grace for growth has spilled across Europe, Central Africa, Asia, Latin America. Their nets are cast wide. They are visible and invisible, overground as well as underground. The Tatas, for example, run more than 100 companies in 80 countries and are one of India's oldest and largest private sector power companies. They own mines, gas fields, steel plants, telephone and cable TV, and broadband networks, and they run whole townships. They manufacture cars and trucks, own the Taj Hotel chain, Jaguar, Land Rover, Daewoo, Tetley Tea, a publishing company, a chain of bookstores, a major brand of iodized salt, and that cosmetics giant, Lakme. Their advertising tagline could easily be, "You can't live without us." According to the rules of the Gush Up gospel, the more you have, the more you can have. The era of the privatization of everything has made the Indian economy one of the fastest growing in the world. However, as with any good old-fashioned colony, one of its main exports is its minerals. India's new mega corporations, Tata's, Jindal's, SR, Reliance, Sterlite, are those who've managed to muscle their way to the head of the spigot that is spewing money extracted from deep inside the earth. It's a dream come true for businessmen to be able to sell what they don't have to buy. The other major source of corporate wealth comes from their land banks. All over the world, weak, corrupt local governments have helped Wall Street brokers, agribusiness corporations, and Chinese billionaires to amass huge tracts of land. In India, the land of millions of people is being acquired and handed over to private corporations for public interest, for special economic zones and infrastructure projects, dams, highways, car manufacture, chemical hubs, and Formula One racing. As Gush Up concentrates wealth onto the tip of a shining pin on which our billionaires pirouette, tidal waves of money crash through the institutions of democracy, the courts, the parliament, as well as the media, seriously compromising their ability to function in the ways that they are meant to. The noisier the carnival around elections, the less sure we are that democracy really exists. Each new corruption scandal that surfaces in India makes the last one look tame. So there was this huge telecom scandal in India which involved millions of dollars. But the privatization and illegal sale of telecom doesn't involve war, displacement, and ecological devastation. The privatization of India's mountains, rivers, and forests does. Perhaps because it does not have the uncomplicated clarity of a straightforward, out-and-out accounting scandal, or perhaps because it's all being done in the name of India's progress. It doesn't have the same resonance with the middle classes. So basically what is happening now is in central India, one of the things that I'd been thinking of for a couple of years, which I find quite shocking, is that there hasn't been a year in India since 1947, which is the year we became independent, or there was a transfer of power between the British and the Indian elite. There hasn't been a single year in which the Indian army has not been deployed against its own people. So from 1947, whether you think about Kashmir, Manipur, Nagaland, Mizoram, Telangana, Hyderabad, Punjab, the army is constantly deployed against people that are supposedly within the nation. And now, because of this new aggressive economic policy, which involves selling the mountains, the rivers, privatizing and mining, there is a war going on against indigenous people in the forests of central India. But the war is not just in the forest. There's a whole bandwidth of resistance movements. Inside the forest are the armed Maoist guerrillas. Outside, there are militant people's movements. There's a whole bandwidth of movements which, academics and journalists like to classify as, oh, this is Gandhian, this is nonviolent, this is violent, this is Maoist. But in fact, people don't think like that. They think strategically. So when you're out in the villages, in the plains, you can't really have a guerrilla army. So you have movements which call themselves Gandhian, or in any case, they are militant but not armed. Inside the forests, which are now filled with paramilitary forces, like in Latin America, like in Colombia, like in Peru, you have these hugely armed soldiers closing in on villages, burning them, raping the women, trying to clear the forest for corporations. And the Prime Minister of India called these indigenous people, who are certainly armed, most of their arms are snatched from the paramilitary forces who are in those forests with grenades and AK-47s and rocket launchers and so on. So they were called India's greatest internal security threat. And the government announced something called Operation Green Hunt, which was supposed to just hunt these people down and clear the forests. So 2 years ago, I actually went into the forest and spent some time with the guerrillas and came out and wrote an essay called Walking with the Comrades. And I'll just read you a little bit, just to give you a kind of texture of what is actually going on in there. The terse typewritten note slipped under my door in a sealed envelope confirmed my appointment with India's single biggest internal security challenge. I'd been waiting for months to hear from them. I had to be at the Ma Danteshwari Mandir in Dantewada, Chhattisgarh, at any of 4 given times on 2 given days. That was to take care of bad weather, punctures, blockades, transport strikes, and sheer bad luck. The note said, writer should have camera, tika, as in bindi, and a coconut. The meter will have a cap, Hindi Outlook magazine, and bananas. The password will be Namaskar Guruji. Namaskar Guruji. I wondered whether the meter and the greeter would be expecting a man, and whether I should get myself a moustache. There are many ways to describe Dantewada. It's an oxymoron. It's a border town smack in the heart of India. It's the epicenter of a war. It's an upside-down, inside-out town. In Dantewada, the police wear plain clothes and the rebels wear uniforms. The jail superintendent is in jail. The prisoners are free. 300 of them escaped from the old town jail 2 years ago. Women who've been raped are in police custody. The rapists give speeches in the bazaars. Across the Indravati River, in the area controlled by the Maoists, is the place police call Pakistan. There, the villages are empty, but the forest is full of people. Children who ought to be in school run wild. In the lovely forest villages, the concrete school buildings have either been blown up and lie in a heap, or they're full of policemen. The deadly war that's unfolding in the jungle is a war that the government of India is both proud and shy of. Operation Green Hunt has been proclaimed as well as denied. P. Chidambaram, India's Home Minister and CEO of the war, says it doesn't exist, that it's a media creation. And yet, substantial funds have been allocated to it, and tens of thousands of troops are being mobilized for it. Though the theater of the war is in the jungles of central India, it will have serious consequences for us all. If ghosts are the lingering spirits of someone or something that has ceased to exist, then perhaps the National Mineral Development Corporation's new four-lane highway crashing through the forest is the opposite of a ghost. Perhaps it's the harbinger of what is still to come. The antagonists in the forest are disparate and unequal in almost every way. On one side is a massive paramilitary force armed with the money, the firepower, the media, and the hubris of an emerging superpower. On the other, ordinary villagers armed with traditional weapons, backed by a superbly organized, hugely motivated Maoist guerrilla fighting force with an extraordinary and violent history of armed rebellion. The Maoists and the paramilitary are old adversaries and have fought older avatars of each other several times before. Telangana in the 50s, West Bengal, Bihar, Srikakulam in Andhra Pradesh in the 60s and 70s, and then again Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, and Maharashtra from the 70s onwards, all the way through to the present. They are familiar with each other's tactics and have studied each other's combat manuals closely. Each time it seemed as though the Maoists or their previous avatars had not just been defeated, but literally, physically exterminated. Each time they re-emerged, more organized, more determined, and more influential than ever. Today, the insurrection has spread through the mineral-rich forests of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Orissa, and West Bengal, homeland to millions of India's tribal people, dreamland to the corporate world. I arrived at the Ma Danteshwari Mandir well in time for my appointment, first day, first show. I had my camera, my small coconut, and a powdery red tika on my forehead. I wondered if someone was watching me and having a laugh. Within minutes, a young boy approached me. He had a cap and a backpack school bag, chipped red nail polish on his fingernails, no Hindi outlook, no bananas. Are you the one who's going in? He asked me. No, namaskar, Guruji. I didn't know what to say. He took out a soggy note from his pocket and handed it to me. It said, Outlook nahi mila, means I couldn't find Outlook. And the bananas? I ate them, he said. I got hungry. He really was a security threat. His backpack said, Charlie Brown, not your ordinary blockhead. He said his name was Mangtu. I soon learned that Dandakaranya, the forest I was about to enter, was full of people who had many names and fluid identities. It was like balm to me, that idea. How lovely not to be stuck with yourself, to become someone else for a while. We walked to the bus stand only a few minutes away from the temple. It was already crowded. Things happened quickly. There were two men on motorbikes. There was no conversation, just a glance of acknowledgement, a shifting of body weight, the revving of engines. I had no idea where we were going. We passed the house of the superintendent of police, which I recognized from my last visit. He was a candid man, the SP. In fact, this man committed suicide a couple of years ago. See, ma'am, frankly speaking, this problem can't be solved by us police or military. The problem with these tribals is that they don't understand greed. Unless they become greedy, there's no hope for us. I have told my boss, remove the force and instead put a TV in every home. Everything will be automatically sorted out. In no time at all, we were riding out of town, no tail. It was a long ride, 3 hours by my watch, and it ended abruptly in the middle of nowhere on an empty road with forest on either side. Mangtu got off, and I did too. The bikes left, and I picked up my backpack and followed the small internal security challenge into the forest. It was a beautiful day. The forest floor was a carpet of gold. In a while, we emerged on the white sandy banks of a broad, flat river. It was obviously monsoon-fed, so now it was more or less a sand flat. At the center, a stream ankle-deep and easy to wade across. Across was Pakistan. Out there, ma'am, the candid SP had said to me, my boys shoot to kill. I remembered that as we began to cross. I saw us in a policeman's rifle sights, tiny figures in a landscape, easy to pick off. But Mangtu seemed quite unconcerned, and I took my cue from him. And then, of course, it goes on to what the weeks that I spent in there. But so the way it works is that the Indian government now, I mean, one of the main things that is happening, the Indian elections will be starting on the 10th of April. And one of the main issues in the election, unstated in some ways, is that the present government, though it tried to do this Operation Green Hunt, and it was pushed back by civil society, by activists, by the physical fight in the forest. So now the corporations are backing a government, or they want to back a government that can actually send out the army and the air force against the poorest people in India to hand over those lands to the corporation. And they want someone who's not going to flinch, who's not going to be upset by what happened over the last 2 years, when Indian civil society, many people just stood up and said, you can't do this. And this government blinked. So now we are looking for a government that isn't going to blink. But obviously, this kind of coercion works for the poor. You can bomb the poor, you can jail them, you can do all of that. But what are you going to do with the others? The army is experienced enough. So I'm just going to read you what the army says now. The Indian Army publicly released its updated doctrine of military psychological operations, which outlines, and I quote, a planned process of conveying a message to a select target audience to promote particular themes that result in desired attitudes and behavior, which affect the achievement of political and military objectives of the country. This process of perception management, it said, would be conducted by using the media available to the services. The army is experienced enough to know that coercive force alone cannot carry out or manage social engineering on the scale that is envisaged by India's planners. Basically, what the Indian government is saying now is that it wants to move 75% of the Indian population into cities, which means something like 500 million people. How do you engineer something on that scale? Certainly not voluntarily. But the war against the poor is one thing, but for the rest of us, the middle class, the intellectuals, the opinion makers, it has to be perception management. And for this, we must turn our attention to the exquisite art of corporate philanthropy. Of late, the mining corporations have embraced the arts, film, art installations, and the rush of literary festivals that have replaced the 1990s obsession with beauty contests. Vedanta, currently mining in the heart of the homelands of the ancient Dongria Kond, is sponsoring a Creating Happiness film competition for young film students. Vedanta's tagline is Mining Happiness. The Jindal Group brings out a contemporary art magazine and supports some of India's major artists who naturally work with stainless steel. SR was the principal sponsor of the Tehelka Newsweek Think Fest that promises these high-octane debates and so on. Tata Steel and Rio Tinto, which has a sordid record of its own, were among the chief sponsors of the Jaipur Literary Festival, which is advertised by the Conoscenti as the greatest literary show on earth. Consolage, the Tata's strategic brand manager, sponsored the festival's press tent. Many of the world's best and brightest writers gathered in Jaipur to discuss love, literature, politics, and Sufi poetry. Some tried to defend Salman Rushdie's right to free speech by reading from his proscribed book, The Satanic Verses. The battles for free speech against Islamist fundamentalism made it to the world's newspapers, and it's important that it did. But there was hardly any report about the festival sponsors' role in the war in the forests, the bodies piling up, the prisons filling up, or about the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and the Chhattisgarh Public Security Act, which make even thinking an anti-government thought a cognizable offense. Or about the mandatory public hearing for the Tata Steel plant in Lohandigura, which local people complained took place hundreds of miles away in the collector's office compound. Where was free speech then? So now you see what's happening is that they're sponsoring these film festivals, these writing festivals, art festivals, college courses. But which of us sinners was going to cast the first stone? Not me, who lives off royalties from corporate publishing houses. We all watch Tata Sky. We surf the net with Tata Photon. We ride in Tata taxis. We stay in Tata hotels. We sip our Tata tea in Tata bone china and stir it with teaspoons made of Tata steel. We buy Tata books in Tata bookshops, and we even eat Tata salt. We are under siege. If the sledgehammer of moral purity is to be the criteria for stone throwing, then the only people who qualify are those who've been silenced already, who live outside the system, the outlaws in the forest, or those whose protests are never covered by the press. But the Litfest gave us our aha moment. Oprah came. She said she loved India and that she would come again and again. It made us proud. But this is only the burlesque end of the exquisite art. And though the Tatas have been involved with corporate philanthropy for almost 100 years now, endowing scholarships and running some excellent educational institutions and hospitals, Indian corporations have only recently been invited into the Star Chamber, the Camera Stellata, the brightly lit word of global corporate governance, deadly for its adversaries, but so artful that you barely know it's there. So this is just a little bit, the last part I'll read before we chat, about foundations like Carnegie, like the Rockefeller, and like Ford, and the history of how they started to operate and what they're doing now. Their enthralling history, which has faded from contemporary memory, began in the United States in the early 20th century, when, kitted out legally in the form of endowed foundations, corporate philanthropy began to replace missionary activity as capitalism and imperialism's road opening and systems maintenance patrol. Among the first to be set up in the United States were the Carnegie Corporation, endowed in 1911 by profits from Carnegie Steel, and the Rockefeller Foundation, endowed in 1914 by Rockefeller, founder of Standard Oil Company, the Tatas and the Ambanis of their time. Some of the institutions financed, given seed money, or supported by the Rockefeller Foundation are the United Nations, the CIA, the Council on Foreign Relations, that's the CFR, New York's most fabulous Museum of Modern Art, and the Rockefeller Center in New York. Rockefeller was America's first billionaire and the world's richest man, and he believed his money was given to him by God, which must have been nice for him. When corporate endowed foundations made their first appearance in the US, there was a fierce debate about their provenance, legality, and lack of accountability. People suggested that if companies had so much surplus money, they should raise the wages of their workers. People made these outrageous suggestions those days, even in America. But the idea of these foundations, so ordinary now, is in fact a leap of the business imagination. Non-tax-paying legal entities with massive resources and an almost unlimited brief, wholly unaccountable, wholly non-transparent. What better way to parlay economic wealth into political, social, and cultural capital, to turn money into power? How else would Bill Gates, who admittedly knows a thing or two about computers, find himself designing education, health, and agriculture policies, not just for the US, but for governments all over the world? Over the years, as people witnessed some of the genuinely good work the foundations did, the direct connection between corporations and the foundations they endowed began to blur, and eventually it faded altogether. In the 1920s, US capitalism had begun to look outwards for raw material and overseas markets. Foundations began to formulate the idea of global corporate governance. In 1924, Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations jointly created what is today the most powerful foreign policy pressure group in the world, the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, which later came to be funded by the Ford Foundation as well. By 1947, the newly created CIA was supported by and working closely with CFR. Over the years, CFR's membership has included 22 US Secretaries of State. There were 5 CFR members in the 1943 steering committee that planned the United Nations, and an $8.5 million grant from Rockefeller. All 11 of the World Bank's presidents since 1946, men who have presented themselves as missionaries to the poor, have been members of the CFR. At Bretton Woods, the World Bank and IMF decided that the US dollar should be the reserve currency of the world, and that in order to enhance the penetration of global capital, it would be necessary to universalize and standardize business practices in an open marketplace. It is towards this end that they spend a large amount of money promoting good governance as long as they control the strings, and the concept of the rule of law, provided they have a say in making the laws, and hundreds of anti-corruption programs to streamline the system they've put in place. Corporate endowed foundations administer trade and channel their power and place their chessmen on the chessboard through a system of elite clubs and think tanks whose members overlap and move in and out through the revolving doors. And contrary to the various conspiracy theories in circulation, particularly among left-wing groups, there's nothing secretive, satanic, or Freemason-like about this arrangement. It's not very different from the way corporations use shell companies and offshore accounts to transfer and administer their money. But the Ford Foundation, liberal foil to the more conservative Rockefeller Foundation, though the two worked together, was set up in 1936. And the Ford Foundation then really thought up this idea of making America a society that lives on credit. And this idea was first, you could first credit it to a department store owner called Edward Filene, who believed in creating a mass consumption society of consumer goods by giving workers affordable access to credit, a radical idea at that time. But it was only half a radical idea, because the other half is that he believed in a more equitable distribution of national income. But many years later, this idea of microcredit and so on has trickled down into places like India and Bangladesh. And now you have people, very poor people in debt committing suicide, like 250,000 Indian farmers. And then, I don't want to talk a lot about it now, but the whole way in which they changed the education system, the way they changed politics into a form of NGOization, they NGOized the feminist movement, they basically funded the politics out of the Black civil rights movement, what they did in South Africa, what they're doing in places like India now. So to understand, in fact, India is a place where people understand this very well. The militant people's movements understand that even if an NGO is in itself doing good work, the whole way in which it's co-opted to serve the international market is something that is even more dangerous than direct corporate funding, mining, and things like that. It's hard for me to explain the whole thing here, but of course that's what the book is about. So maybe, Siddhartha, we can chat about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Arundhati. Can everyone hear us back there? You have a full house, and I can see you've made everybody happy, not just in the room, the ministers, the government, the military, the foundations. Who have you left out? So there's just so many things that I want to ask you, but let's just start off a little bit with the question about capitalism, From Capitalism, a Ghost Story. And I was just very struck by the figures that you read out at the very beginning, that India's 100 richest people own assets equivalent to 1/4 of the GDP. Now, and then you read that wonderful passage about exactly how much the Ambanis own, or how much the Tata company owns. And I suppose that kind of concentration of wealth we've become sadly quite used to across, not just in India, but that is true in China, that is true in the United States, that is increasingly true across the world. So that is very much Indian capitalism has in common with capitalism around the world. But I'm also struck by this other sort of figure that you have, I think just a few pages later, when you say that after 20 years of growth, and you have growth within scare quotes, just to make the growth people happy, you write, after 20 years of growth, 60% of India's workforce is self-employed, and 90% of India's labor force works in the unorganized sector. Is that, and I think that's something that might be worth talking about, especially for those here who are not familiar with India or South Asia. Could you talk a little bit more about these 90% or the 60% self-employed, or the 90%, these, what we refer to as the masses, or the people? Why? Why is it after 20 years of growth that they are working in the unorganized sector? What does unorganized sector mean? Could you explain that?
Well, I think when in the late 80s and the early 90s, when let's say, when Soviet communism lost the war in Afghanistan, and it became a unipolar world, and India, which used to be aligned with the Soviet Union, began to see itself as a natural ally of Israel and the US, and it changed its economic policies. And one of those things involved dismantling, protection to workers, and and on the other hand, they would pass laws like laws for minimum wages, but it was understood that they were never going to be implemented. And people have seen when you're, like, let's say, I've written and followed a lot on the issue of dam building, where people displaced in their hundreds of thousands are told that, oh, when this dam is built, you'll all get a job. But there are no jobs, The mechanization and all of that is taking place. So what we have is what is known as jobless growth.
Right.
And it's one of the great areas of growth is the IT sector, for example. But on the what you have is a country where a small section of people have become very wealthy, right. But even a small percentage of a population like India still means it's a very big market.
Right.
And the rest have just fallen away outside the radar altogether.
Now, you've been involved, I think, or you've followed some of the labor strikes, like at this factory, just in the Honda factory. Is that right?
Maruti.
The Maruti factory.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that, on how you see what happens to workers? Because these workers are essentially former agriculturists, right, who are getting jobs in the cities. So what are the kind of struggles they face? Why aren't they doing well with 20 years of growth? Since we are buying lots of cars and things like that, why are they not doing well?
Because I think, again, in the Maruti factory, there are a few workers who are regular in the organized sector.
Right.
And the rest are unorganized sector workers. And the pressure on them to work faster, to produce more cars, to have less free time, to refuse, they're refused, they're not allowed to have a union.
Right.
And so basically what happened was finally there was a strike, and according to the workers, there were some people who entered the factory in workers' uniforms who were not really workers.
Right.
And one management person was killed. The person who was killed happens to be the one management person who was actually on the side of the workers. And now there are hundreds of them who have been put into prison. The rest of them have been sacked. And you have workers just brought in from elsewhere, paid very low wages, and who are willing to work as virtually slave labor. This is what's happening everywhere. I mean, if you go to the outskirts of Delhi, it's worse than medieval what's going on. So and Maruti is supposed to be the sort of pilot operation of India shining. It's the show window. So the people in the villages are being displaced and losing their livelihoods and their land. But now there's trouble in the show window as well, which is a real problem.
So in terms of the trouble, I mean, the growth in 20 years, it hasn't led to much for the people, for the 900 million or so, for the majority of the people. It's been slowing down. What effect is this having on the elections that are next month? Can you talk about that a little bit? We have you mentioned a little bit during your reading that, the Congress Party has been in charge for since 2004, so 10 years. And so it has actually overseen this sort of expansion of the market, the expansion of the middle class, the expansion of the consumers. So why do people want the Congress out? Or why do a very vocal section of the elites, the middle class, the well-to-do, why do they want the Congress out? And why do they want the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, in?
Well, I'll connect it a little bit to your earlier question about capitalism. See, I think that in India, we're still not an entirely capitalist country. We are also, there's a great amount of feudalism, communalism, and fundamentally caste, involved in our society. And one of the things that has happened in India since the time the markets were open to international finance, at that very same time started a hugely sort of Hindu chauvinist movement led by the BJP, obviously, and this communalism and corporatism were going hand in hand. And with the slowdown of the economy in the world, what happened is that this huge expectations of this very brash new middle class has turned dangerous. They were sitting in an aircraft hoping to take off, and suddenly it's just frozen, and all those expectations have turned to kind of panic. And there's a hope that a more aggressive government can push this through. And the Congress is, of course, seen as being, and is, but so is everybody else, just deeply corrupt, deeply rotten. And the impatience of the middle class is taking the form of these huge sort of protests, on different issues, but mainly on the anti-corruption issue that started with Anna Hazare, and it was covered 24/7 by all these corporate media channels, and that was the beginning of the BJP and the various very, very right-wing groups were backing it at the time, and that was the beginning of the end of the Congress in some ways, because it was just being portrayed as this weak government that couldn't push through policy.
And why was it seen as a weak? Because it wasn't willing to commit itself fully to a kind of Hindu majoritarian identity, or not as much as the BJP?
Yeah, well, that's a historical, if you go back in time, right, to the turn of the 20th century, you had, in the freedom movement, you had these two factions in the Congress known as the Naram Dal and the Garam Dal, the militant and the moderate, and now they just happen to be two different political parties, but they're playing out the same trajectory, so that is in the nature of it. That is absolutely what the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, sells. It's Hindu nationalism, and the Congress sells the secularism, though actually, in fact, like I was saying, since 1947, if you look at these wars that the Indian Army has fought, Assam, Manipur, Nagaland, Punjab, Mizoram, Telangana, the wars are always fought against the other, whether they are Muslims, tribals, Sikhs, Christians, Adivasis. It's an upper caste Hindu state at war with the other.
So that remains consistent no matter which
in both.
party.
It's just that one does by day what the other does by night.
Right. But there's something also, but isn't there something very, very marked about this moment where the prime ministerial candidate for the BJP, Narendra Modi, is the most aggressive of and they're all aggressive, but he is the most aggressive. He has a record of, being the chief minister in Gujarat, where this sort of, enormous incidents of violence took place. He was banned from entering the United States. He was denied a visa to enter the United States, partly because of that. But now he's very much being projected as this sort of, a man who's a good manager. He has a vision of a corporate India, and there's an enormous sort of social media support among the Indian elites for him. There's a kind of branding of him. There's a kind of branding of him And now even the United States, on the UK, the European governments have come around. They seem to be on the verge of accepting him as this sort of the person who's going to lead India. So is this a kind of, even though there is no difference in some sense between the Congress and the BJP, one does by day and the other by night, there seems something particularly marked about this moment. And with Modi, what is your thought about that? What do you think about that?
I think that we are poised in a very momentous and slightly dangerous space because in 2002 when 58 Hindu pilgrims were burnt alive in a train in Gujarat, and following that, we still don't know who burnt them or how that happened, but following that was this sort of genocidal pogrom against Muslims where more than 1,000 people were just burnt and lynched, and women were gang raped and so on, and 100,000 were driven from their homes. And now we are in a stage where people are saying, why do you have to go on about that? Put it in your past. We need a development chief minister. Here's this person who's made, of course now even that idea of Gujarat as being this state which is at the forefront of progress and development has been taken apart. But the reason...
How so?
How so? Because if you look at the Human Development Index, you look at the levels of malnutrition, all those, they are there on the internet for anyone to see. Yeah. But I think the reason he's been backed is because he shows himself to be a man who will not blink who's able to be brutal. And the brutality is not going to be against Muslims. When someone is brutal against Muslims, I learned a huge lesson when Gujarat happened, when the killings happened, and I wrote about them with this kind of outrage. And obviously, I was appealing to what I thought was a humanness where people would react with horror, and you just got this cold look which said, so what? They deserve it,
And this is from the middle class.
Yeah, from I won't say there's a huge sort of community of Indians who are outraged, and even today there are people who still can't believe this is happening. But now the hope is that this brutality will be turned against those who are fighting these big corporate projects, in the villages, in the forests, and that is what the corporations are backing him for. All the big corporations are behind him,
So there's a kind of almost colonial sort of process of extraction of resources that you describe in Chhattisgarh, in Orissa. But what are the people's movements? What are the protests beyond just the Maoists or the Naxalites in the forest? Can you talk about that? Because you travel a lot through the country. I've seen this. You travel all over. What do you see when you go to, say, Orissa, or when you go to the Northeast, or when you go to Kashmir, or when you go to the South? What do you see in terms of people protesting? Because this is something that's completely filtered out from the media. We don't see any of this either in the Indian media or in the Western press.
Well, what is happening in India is that, how have countries in the West, how have they become industrialized, modernized? That has happened through a history of colonialism, right? A colonialism where raw materials were used to feed the industry. And in India doesn't have colonies, so it's colonizing itself. Right. So you have, as I keep saying, you have a middle class and elite that have seceded into outer space, and they look down and say, what's our bauxite doing in their mountains, and what's our water doing in their rivers, and there's a sense of entitlement, And people, I mean, I have to say, people have told me openly that, look, all these other countries, they have a history. And by that they mean they have a history of committing genocide. And, some people have to pay the price for progress. This I have heard told to me many times. But I'll say this, that, the understanding of what is going on is tremendous amongst people who are involved in the resistance movements. And this is why, I always find it surprising when people say, oh, she's an anti-national, I don't think that anybody could be prouder of how with such wisdom, with such courage, with such intelligence, these battles are being waged, and with such profound questioning. Because it's not just a battle about, oh, this is my land, I don't want to leave my home. It's really a question that is being asked about the nature of happiness, about the nature of what we call civilization, and that profound question is being posed by people whose bodies are on the line. And as I said, these movements are very, very varied, Like people. When I wrote "Walking with the Comrades," I was criticized brutally for that. Of course, I was called a Maoist and so on. I'm not a Maoist, but in the land of Gandhi, how can you, support these people with guns? I said, no. Tell me, if 1,000 border security force surround the village of of indigenous people and start burning it and raping women and chasing them away, what are they supposed to do? I mean, can hungry people go on a hunger strike? Can people who don't have any access to, TV go around acting Gandhian? They can't. So while theoretically, in TV studios and in academia, people discuss violence and non-violence, it's actually strategic. I mean, the same person can be a Gandhian on the street and a Maoist in the forest, You just have to do what you can do to fight.
So do you know how do the Comrades take your book? Did you ever get any feedback? You're used to criticism. Have you had criticism from them?
Oh, no, I had a kind of very difficult, because the forest is under siege. It's actually terrible what's going on there. People can't come out, people can't get medicines, and it's just they're just being killed. And so I think it might have been 6 months after I came out and after the Walking with the Comrades was published. There's a part in the book where in the essay where I'm lying amongst these rocks with all these, young sort of guerrillas. And I say, oh, I'm in my private suite in a 1,000-star hotel. So 6 months after the essay was published, passed from hand to hand to hand to hand to hand to hand, I got this thing which they call a biscuit, which is this little piece of paper which is folded 95 times. Open it, and it was a letter from there, from the forest, and it said, "Didi, aapke likhne ke baad jungle mein khushi ki lehar phaili thi," which means after you wrote, a wave of happiness went through the forest, and it was signed by the PRO 1,000-star hotel.
So they do have a sense of humor.
Yeah. They sure have a sense of humor.
So in terms of criticism, let's talk about the most recent sort of thing that you've written. You've brought a copy of the book, I see, an introduction to Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, and it was excerpted in Caravan magazine, and it was called The Doctor and the Saint. Can you talk a little bit about it, as well as what the response has been, what drove you to the project?
Well, Annihilation of Caste is the text of a 80-year-old speech that was never delivered by, I think, one of modern India's greatest intellectuals, called Dr. Ambedkar, who was
with a New York connection, a Columbia connection.
With a Columbia connection, yes. He received a PhD in Columbia, but he was born into a family of who were at that time called untouchables. And he published this speech in 1936, where soon after declaring that though he was born a Hindu, he wasn't going to die a Hindu. And
and he converted to Buddhism.
He converted much later to Buddhism. And Mahatma Gandhi basically replied to this provocation, really, of his, and it was a debate between the two. And Ambedkar was really, he challenged Gandhi in every way, politically, but intellectually, but morally, So it's a text of a speech that has existed since then. It's been read and reread. It's available everywhere. And a publisher asked me if I would write the introduction, and I took a long time to do it, because while I was looking at this debate between Gandhi and Ambedkar, I was just appalled by what I learned about Gandhi.
You're quite harsh on him.
Well, I'm not as harsh as I should have been, I think. But so it took me right back to Gandhi's views on caste, which took me back to 1893 when he first arrived in South Africa, we of course knew that he had been called a Mahatma soon after he came back from South Africa for what he's supposed to have done there, but what he did there was extremely disturbing. But anyway, when I wrote the introduction, it was a pretty long introduction, and it's just come out just like a few days ago. So I think there was a reaction from certain Dalit scholars who said I think people in the US are familiar with these debates too, that no one who is not a Dalit has the right to write about Ambedkar. It's not a position that I would agree with. But again, it would, I think go back a lot to looking at the ways in which we are now hermetically sealing ourselves into certain kinds of identities in which literature can't exist anymore, because nobody can write about the other without being accused of being in cliched ways. So, but I think that's just the book has just come out, so the reaction, in my case, almost everything I write, for the first 6 months I have to duck for cover, and then we'll see. And then the text, because the trouble is that, and I understand it, I understand that the fact that I've become a little too well known for my own good, so anything you write gets so much attention that it seems almost unfair, but that I can't stop writing. I have to write what I have to write, and then we'll see.
Books are, becoming quite problematic in India, isn't it? In the last, the most recent case was that Wendy Doniger's history, The Hindus and Alternative History, was called back by the publisher and pulped by Penguin, who publishes both of us, I take it. And you wrote to them in protest about that. Can we talk about that? This is, again, it's amazing that, it's supposed to be free market, it's supposed to be a democracy, but that a book is just being withdrawn because a small pressure group says that it's offensive. Do you think that this is going to go on? This is going to happen even more? And you yourself, of course, have these court cases for speeches and for, I suppose, all the way back to the novel.
Yeah.
So can you talk about this whole, this problem with books in India?
I think it's quite fascinating, that as you legislate more about free speech and as you make more of a song and dance about free speech, in fact, in India, what the Urdu and Persian poet Ghalib could say in the 19th century about his relationship with Islam, nobody could say today. What the great short story writer Manto could say about Mullanas and Mullahs, nobody can say today. What Ambedkar could say about Hinduism, what Nehru could say about Kashmir, you can't say now, It's almost unbelievable how little you can say now. And on the issue of Wendy Doniger, it was really sad because it wasn't even as if there was a court case or a ban order or anything. It was just a group, a right-wing Hindu group that said their sentiments were hurt by her book on Hinduism, and Penguin sort of just pulled back, which frightened many other people because, at least Penguin has the resources to fight a legal case. Other people don't. When I wrote The God of Small Things, 5 lawyers filed a criminal case against me for corrupting public morality. And then, I had to appear in court, and by which time I had won the Booker Prize, and so, they kind of wanted to claim me but not claim the book. So the judge would appear in court, and he said once, every time this case comes before me, I get chest pains. But it went on for 10 years, Then, of course, there's this threat of sedition, right. And almost everything you write or say, you kind of begin to look for that brown envelope in the post, summoning you, or some person has filed a case somewhere, and it's really what has happened is that, it's not like you living in a dictatorship where the government has terrorized you and it's creating subversive and beautiful literature. It's not that. What has happened is that the censorship has been outsourced to the mob. So people, people can trash your house. They can trash your book launches, as has happened with me several times. Yes. People can do anything, and there are these little vigilante groups who've taken it upon themselves to do it. So you're left to the danger of becoming someone who censors themselves all the time.
But you haven't, clearly.
No, I have to some extent, how do you know what I would like to say? Really?
On that note, why don't we open up the floor to questions?
Sure.
I think we're doing well in terms of time. Why don't we do that?
Oh, they're already there.
Oh. Oh my goodness.
What's that?
It's probably immediately like this. What we were taking together.
Dear Arundhati, some call you anti-American. What is good and worth cherishing about the United States of America? And do you have advice for the anti-capitalist movement in the US?
That's the next question.
Yeah. Well, the thing about people saying so-and-so is anti-American or anti-national, now I think it cedes to whoever is saying it the right to decide what is American or what is Indian or what is national. We don't give them that right. We don't give them that right. And I don't actually think that, personally, I don't think in terms of countries anymore, and I don't mean in this kind of touchy-feely hippie way. But what I feel is that, the elites have all sort of seceded into outer space and found some country of their own there. And, what is there now that we can say, we can say this. When I say India, or when someone says India, I really don't know what they mean. When someone says, can you give us an interview about Indian women? I'm like, what does that mean? There are Indian women who are the most liberated, unique and free women that I know, and at the same time, you don't have to journey 5 minutes to know that there's female feticide and people are living in the, medieval times. So how do we think in terms of countries? Sometimes I really don't understand it, but I'm certainly not anti-American, though I'm anti very many American policies made by the American government. Do I have advice for the anti-capitalist movement in the US? I'm very bad at giving advice, really bad at giving or taking advice. But no, so I don't have any advice.
Here's one.
You mentioned that India is being recognized as the land of Gandhi. However, is it not largely a perception of the Western world? Is it not recognized in any manner relative to Bhagat Singh, the revolutionary who strived to bring India's independence prior to his own execution? Well, Bhagat Singh is one of the very heroic young Indians who was hanged when he was 21 or 22 years old. In fact, on the 23rd of March, I think.
Goodness.
And the thing is that, he's one of those figures who's just appropriated by everybody now, which is what happens to icons. But certainly, I would say that Bhagat Singh is a much more important, revolutionary, and necessary figure than Gandhi to India.
Oh, there's more coming.
Do you think that you would have received the same resistance to The Doctor and the Saint, which is the name of my introduction, had it been published separate from Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste? Well, I don't know. I mean, I think there would have been a resistance of another kind, but the real problem would be that what it is saying about Mahatma Gandhi, who the establishment considers is at the moral coordinates of India, would have created a problem at some stage. But the thing is that I think that Annihilation of Caste is a text that is extremely important for people who haven't heard about Ambedkar and who haven't read it to read. And this introduction is to an annotated edition of the Annihilation of Caste. And I wrote that introduction, and I took care to write that introduction because I feel that Ambedkar is someone who's just been erased from history by the Indian establishment. And I wanted to use whatever influence that I had to bring that text to the world which doesn't know about Ambedkar. You know, he's a hero among Dalits in India, but he's virtually unknown in many places, and in where there should have been a great solidarity between the civil rights movement and the politics of Black America and the Dalits of India. You have a strange situation where Gandhi is worshipped by Black people in America because they don't know the history of his absolute contempt for Black people in South Africa. Oh, another question for advice. Any advice for a struggling writer? Never ask anyone for advice. When can we expect to read your next book? Look, if I come back here without my next novel, just don't come, okay? Just leave the auditorium empty. Just say, we're not listening to anything more until we have some fiction, because I really want to do that now, you know, which is not to say that it's not political, but it's a different and more subversive way of being political. How do you see social movements and the possibilities of popular politics in India after the new Land Acquisition Act and the court ruling by the Dongria Code against Vedanta? I think that social movements and people's movements are going to come under a tremendous amount of pressure after, not that they aren't already, but if we do indeed see a government headed by Narendra Modi. You know, in a place like Chhattisgarh, I mean, all of you must have followed the protests that happened in Delhi after that young girl was gang raped and murdered on a bus. Of course, you know, the media refers to it as the gang rape, as if it's much worse to be raped than to be murdered. But they don't even refer to the fact that she was actually killed. But during that year, when that one incident happened, 1,500 Dalit women were raped by upper caste men. You know, I mean, 650 Dalits were murdered. But in Chhattisgarh, in this area where I had gone walking with the Comrades, a woman called Soni Sori, she was an indigenous tribeswoman, a school teacher, who was accused. She was captured by the police, accused of, you know, being a courier for the Maoists or something. And she was taken to a police station, and she had stones pushed up her vagina. And the policeman who did it was given the President's Gallantry Award for bravery. You know, so on the one hand, you have these fast-track courts and all this talk about what has happened to women, what is happening to women. And on the other hand, you have an institutionalized violence against women going on. And the Chhattisgarh Special Public Security Act, it actually, basically anybody who is resisting this development project can be called a Maoist and thrown into jail. And the jails, I mean, we had 3,000 custodial deaths, I think, in prison year before last. In Kashmir, there are thousands of people who have been killed, thousands who have disappeared. But yet India is known as a great democracy, and there is a part of India which is a great democracy. It's just that it doesn't apply to all the people. It just applies to some people, So I think social movements are going to be under tremendous pressure. I think we're going to see the army called out against the poorest people. And what India is very good at doing, the government, is that it'll take young men from Kashmir and deploy them in Chhattisgarh. It'll take people from Chhattisgarh and deploy them in Assam. It'll take people from Assam and deploy them in Telangana. In this way, like a good colonial power, it pits people against each other.
Do you want to take an India question or a writing question? Not that they are mutually exclusive.
Food question.
Food question. There are no food questions here. Not yet.
Often the discourse and writing, both fictional and non-fictional, within the Muslim American community are highly apologetic and stay within the safety net of acceptability, which only ends up sidelining our identity. What advice would you give to young Muslim Americans and other minority writers in developing a strong voice in their writing? No, look, honestly, I really don't know how to give advice, But I think looking for acceptability is a very dangerous path for a writer. Okay. Because, for example, when I write in all the work I've written, including The God of Small Things, it's never written seeking acceptability. In fact, beforehand, I know that I haven't, written it from a position where I have a constituency that is going to stand up and say, "Well done." It's always something which makes a troubled path through. And at the same time, it isn't as though you can just be brash and say, the craft of writing is something which I think the more attention you pay to it, the less obvious it is, It's like, I remember a few years ago, I was in The Hague because I had been invited to speak at this World Water Forum, it was called, and I didn't go. And then I heard that there was a whole delegation from India that had gone to promote dams, and so I just went to wreck the enterprise. And I was sitting at, I was on some panel which was supposed to be a panel of writers. They were not really writers. They were all sort of writers of policy documents for the privatization of water. And we were all asked to introduce ourselves and say why we write about water. So the person sitting next to me was an American, and he said, "Well, I write about water because I'm paid to. And I just want to say that God gave us the rivers, but He didn't put in the delivery systems, and for this we need private enterprise." So I said, "Well, I write about water because I'd be paid a great deal not to, And then I said, everyone here calls themselves a writer. But what writers do is they spend a lifetime trying to close the gap between thought and word. And here you are, all of you in this auditorium, not you, they, I'm talking about them. Here you are doing the exact opposite. You're developing a language to mask thought, you know? So you're doing the exact opposite of what writers do. And you can't really, you know, how you develop the craft of saying what you want to say or leaving the gaps or whatever it is. I can't advise you, you know, but I can only say that acceptability spells death to a writer.
We have lots of questions, but not enough time. So maybe a last question?
Okay.
How about this one? Anthony.
What do I read? Is that a question?
Anthony pointed it out specifically.
Well, I read, I mean, I read everything from really bad, you know, human rights reports to poetry to a lot of things. But if I just wanted to mention one writer, I mean, not that there are not 100 I could mention, but I would say for this evening's kind of talking, I would read Eduardo Galeano.
Thank you, Arundhati. I think now we can sort of move to the next stage of the program, which is...
Yeah, I think I'll just end with a 3-minute reading from my first, from the first political essay that I wrote.
And she's going to read all your questions afterwards. I'm not censoring them or hiding them. She's going to read the ones that have asked for responses. I'll give them all to her.
This is from an essay called The End of Imagination, which happened just after the nuclear tests that India conducted. In early May, before the bomb, I left home for 3 weeks. I thought I would return. I had every intention of returning. Of course, things haven't worked out quite the way I planned. While I was away, I met a friend of mine whom I've always loved for, among other things, her ability to combine deep affection with a frankness that borders on savagery. I've been thinking about you, she said, about the God of small things, what's in it, what's over it, under it, around it, above it. She fell silent for a while. I was uneasy and not at all sure that I wanted to hear the rest of what she had to say. She, however, was sure that she was going to say it. In this last year, less than a year actually, you've had too much of everything: fame, money, prizes, adulation, criticism, condemnation, ridicule, love, anger, hate, envy, generosity, everything. In some ways, it's a perfect story, perfectly baroque in its excess. The trouble is that it has, or can have, only one perfect ending. Her eyes were on me, bright with a slanting, probing brilliance. She knew that I knew what she was going to say. She was insane. She was going to say that nothing that happened to me in the future could ever match the buzz of this, that the whole of the rest of my life was going to be vaguely unsatisfying. And therefore, the only perfect ending to this story would be death, my death. The thought had occurred to me too, of course it had, the fact that all this global dazzle, these lights in my eyes, the applause, the flowers, the photographers, the journalists feigning a deep interest in my life, yet struggling to get a single fact right, the men in suits fawning over me, the shiny hotel bathrooms with endless towels. None of it was likely to happen again. Would I miss it? Had I grown to need it? Was I a fame junkie? Would I have withdrawal symptoms? I told my friend that there was no such thing as a perfect story. I said, in any case, hers was an external view of things, this assumption that the trajectory of a person's happiness, or let's say fulfillment, had peaked and now must trough because she had accidentally stumbled upon success. It was premised on the unimaginative belief that wealth and fame were the mandatory stuff of everybody's dreams. You live too long in New York, I told her. There are other worlds, other kinds of dreams, dreams in which failure is feasible, honorable, sometimes even worth striving for. Worlds in which recognition is not the only barometer of brilliance or human worth. There are plenty of warriors whom I know and love, people far more valuable than myself, who go to war each day knowing in advance that they will fail. True, they are less successful in the most vulgar sense of the word, but by no means less fulfilled. The only dream worth having, I told her, is to dream that you live while you're alive and die only when you're dead. Which means exactly what? She asked. I tried to explain, but didn't do a very good job of it. Sometimes I need to write, to think. So I wrote it down for her on a paper napkin. And this is what I wrote. To love, to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to try and to respect strength, never power, above all, to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget. Thank you.